Well, earlier I spoke with Bassam Khawaja, a law lecturer at Columbia University who's been observing the protests, and he holds concerns for his students.
I think the last 24 hours have been horrifying for a lot of us who teach here at Columbia. We're currently locked out of the university. The administration is not letting anyone in unless you live on campus. But we saw last night that the university, for the second time in just a few weeks, invited New York's police department back onto campus to arrest students who've been protesting in solidarity with the people of Gaza. The police entered with guns drawn, entered a building that students have been occupying, locked down the multiple blocks around the university, arrested more than 100 people at Columbia, and students are now showing videos and claiming that students are actually injured and are even hospitalized as a result of these arrests. And so, as someone who teaches, who has students at Columbia, I'm really horrified that the administration is once again bringing police back onto campus to address protesters who had been protesting peacefully for many weeks now.
I mean, I believe Columbia University, the president there has said that the drastic escalation occurred after months-long protests pushed the university to the brink. Did something need to happen, in your opinion?
So I think Columbia has chosen time and again to escalate in response to these protests. We've seen protests across the country play out in many different ways. Some U.S. universities have negotiated with protesters. Some have just let them be and mostly ignored them. The protests were by and large extremely peaceful. I visited the encampment several times. It was mostly students studying, sometimes praying, sometimes holding Passover Seder. Columbia has responded by suspending students en masse, bringing police in to arrest more than 100 protesters, evicting some students from their housing. And so this latest escalation where students occupied a building was in response to Columbia again suspending students without any kind of due process, no hearing, just letters that they received directly. And so this is, I think we should also point out, a building that's been occupied many times by Columbia students over the years in response to the Vietnam War, in response to apartheid in South Africa. So it's not something we haven't seen before. I really have to stress this was a massively disproportionate response from the administration, bringing in really a sea of police in on our own students.
We know that this isn't just happening in Columbia University in New York. It's happening in universities across the country. We saw protests at UCLA as well, where police were sent to the campus there. What do you make of other sorts of protests around the country?
So I think this is something that's certainly caught on across the country. Protests are happening in many, many universities here. I think the New York Times here is tracking now 1,000 arrests on college campuses in the United States. As I said, some schools have been much more tolerant of them, but overall, as a human rights lawyer, as someone who studies human rights, I think we're extremely concerned that we're seeing really a crackdown on these protests in particular. And Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the UN's highest human rights official have all raised serious concerns about freedom of expression and assembly on U.S. campuses today. I think if you saw these types of arrests happening in Hong Kong or in Egypt, the U.S. State Department would be condemning them. That's not been their approach here.
So just unpacking that idea a bit more, free speech is obviously protected in the Constitution in America. Where is the conversation around free speech and potentially then hate speech?
Yeah, so I think, there's no room for hate speech on our campuses. There's no room for any kind of racism or anti-Semitism on our campuses. But I think you put your finger on that exact point. We need to be distinguishing between those two issues. And so while we don't have any tolerance for anti-Semitism, we also need to make very clearly the point that protesting in favor of Palestinian human rights is not in itself anti-Semitic. And we've seen that line being blurred by officials from the White House to the New York City mayor's office to Columbia's own administration all the way down. And that's massively worrying for human rights, for freedom of expression. As you noted, is protected in the U.S. Constitution. It's protected under international law. And it's something that we in our university need to be respecting at the same time as we make sure that it's a safe place for all of our students.
What is your understanding, Bassam, of why these students are protesting? Is it solely about the war in Gaza?
Yeah, I mean, I've spoken to many of these students. They're extremely well informed. They've read the news. They've seen the death tolls come out of Gaza, and they're extremely concerned that their university is invested, that its money is invested in this war, and they've been calling for divestment very clearly. I think it's something that the university should at least be having a conversation on, and so far that does not seem to be the case.
Just finally, Bassam, where do you see this and how do you see this playing out on a timeline? We know that Columbia University students have gone online till the end of the year. Where do you see this ending?
Yeah, unfortunately, for a university that's complained that the protests were disrupting campus life, the university's own measures have been extremely disruptive. We're all locked out of campus now. The university has asked the New York Police Department to remain on campus for the next 2 weeks until graduation. We'll have to see how things play out, but the students have made it very clear that they don't plan on going anywhere.